first book I read this month was Oriental Tales from Marguerite Yourcenar. This is the second book of hers I've read. I read the Memoirs of Hadrian early last year. This is a collection of short stories that are all based on Asian cultures, as far as China and Japan, and a lot of stories from sort of the Middle East and Turkey and that area as well. I really liked the Memoirs of Hadrian when I read it. It had this really nice classical register throughout, and the tone that she sets is really, it's a sort of timeless tone. And so these sort of old style tales are perfect for what she was doing, and these ones actually come earlier in her career than Hadrian. The first story in here, How Wang Fo Was Saved, it sets a really good tone. It's about this Chinese painter who is sort of taken prisoner by an emperor or king who takes issue with sort of his paintings being too beautiful, and the world can never actually mirror what is reflected in his images. And in the end, he sort of he escapes the clutches of this emperor into one of his own paintings, and so disappearing into art, and art being more beautiful than the world. These ideas sort of persist throughout the stories. What got me really excited about this one originally was this story in here, The Last Love of Prince Genji. And if you've read The Tale of Genji, there's a really remarkable moment, which I suppose spoilers for, a book that's over 1,000 years old. When Prince Genji dies, it's written in the book, it's only depicted as a blank chapter. There's a normal chapter heading and everything, and in the edition I had, it maintains the same format, but it just says a chapter number, blank page. And this story attempts to imagine the end of Genji and what that looks like. And she writes of one of his more jilted lovers. There's a lover of his who, in the original Tale of Genji, is sort of forgotten and is depicted as being sort of homely and of low birth, a woman he doesn't necessarily have the fondest memories of, despite their physical engagements. And as he is aging and dying, this woman is the one to take care of him. And the ending of this story, I truly, it brought tears to my eyes. I thought it was so beautiful. And especially coming off of reading the Tale of Genji a few years ago, it's like, I was sucked right back into that world. It really is like a transportation into an entirely new planet, basically, when you read that book. And so the fact that she was able to capture any of that is really remarkable. From there, most of these stories kind of have this timeless feeling to them, maybe because the setting is in the Middle East, and they take on this sort of almost biblical register when you're reading them. It just reminds you of stories that would have always existed, or would have been told to you when you were in Sunday school or whatever. And in that way, along with the slimness of the volume, it really reminds me of Rilke's Stories of God, which I read a long time ago, and I'm itching to read again. These brief stories of cultures that it's so rooted in everything that I grew up in, and that a lot of Western cultures come from, that they seem kind of eternal. These are translated in partnership with Alberto Manguel, which is also really interesting. Manguel I read earlier this year, and he's a really interesting guy. Yourcenar, I think she takes part in a lot of her translations, because I remember reading Hadrian, and it had the same credit, translated by Alberto Manguel in collaboration with the author. I can't remember at the moment who translated my copy of Memoirs of Hadrian, but it seems that Yourcenar likes to take part in that process. So I really enjoyed this book. I really like everything, both of the books of hers I've read. I have a couple collections of her essays back in the States that I'm even more excited about reading now that I've finished this one. I followed that with Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, and I think something about these super ancient cultural ideas and societies from the Oriental tales, something like clicked in my head, reminded me I had this book and wanted to read it. I heard about it originally, I think, in a criticism or a review of *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. And I read that book 5 or 6 years ago, and it really didn't do anything for me. And something I read online said that a lot of his ideas are kind of taken directly from this book. So I think that's what clued me into it originally. And I found a cheap copy out here used at one of the used bookstores. Anderson is concerned with the origins of nationalism, and he's dealing with a lot of ideas taken from Marxism, and he goes into all of these technologies and institutions that arrived in the kind of from like the 15th, 16th century into the 19th century, and how they're implemented across the world by European cultures, and how these sort of gradually necessitated the ideas of like a connected community, a nationality, so to speak. This is a revised edition, which I think is pretty key because there's a one of the additional chapters he added after this one here, Census Map Museum. This is kind of the most interesting point that I found, or the one of the more direct descriptions of what he's talking about. He says that nationalism emerges clearly in these three technologies: the census, the map, and the museum, and the way that they had to categorize and define and draw lines on our societies. The idea of that essay being missing from the original version is pretty wild to me. I think the writing in this book is good enough, but it's not necessarily captivating prose. I don't think it really needs to be. It's definitely something you need to be interested more directly in the contents. So if you've heard good things about it, or if you read *Sapiens* and you didn't like it so much and you're itching for something more, *Imagined Communities* by Benedict Anderson, reflections on the origin and spread of nationalism. After that, I read *Enormous Changes at the Last Minute* by Grace Paley. This is the second collection of Paley's that I've read. The first one I read, *The Little Disturbances of Men*. I read it a few years ago, and short stories don't stick in my mind so well. I kind of remember the feeling being a little bit like off-putting. The sort of things she writes about aren't necessarily strange, but her tone and the way she presents them kind of shakes you a little bit. And that feeling continues here. These stories are kind of hard to follow, but as you progress through the stories, the characters kind of reappear, and they're not necessarily consistent, or I should say there might be some contradictions or some loose threads in their roles or personalities, or the way that they act within the stories, but they create this kind of tapestry of a rather mundane society in I think in Brooklyn, New York. It's kind of these mundane issues, but the writing is so surreal and so out there that these daily problems take on these really, really far out properties. She addresses this quality of her writing directly in the book. There's a story, I think, this story towards the end, A Conversation with My Father, it directly deals with how sort of hard to parse these stories are, and the way that they kind of meander and have really surreal images of people, living in trees and other really far out stuff. And so it's cool that she's aware of it. She's sort of in on the joke, or she's in on it. She's with you, interacting directly with the strangeness that's going on. And I really enjoyed that. Another thing I really liked about this book is that she sort of presents this sort of archetype of 20th century Judaism, which I don't think Grace Paley is a quote unquote Jewish writer, but she depicts a style of Judaism or Jewish attributes, which it reminds me of when I was going to like Sunday school and I would see the pictures of the former presidents on the wall, and it would be these really stern looking Jewish men with their glasses, like sort of staring at you and judging you. Also, kind of gave me Hey Arnold vibes, for what that's worth. Out here in Japan, you can actually find Grace Paley's books pretty easily because they've been translated into the Japanese by Haruki Murakami. And so those books are everywhere. You can find the Japanese versions super cheap, and they keep these hopper images on the covers, and they have this nice like color scheme to them. Finding her books out here is not so difficult, so that's good for me, and maybe I'll keep my eyes open for I think she only has one more collection of stories. I'll get to that one soon. I went a little thematic this month. I read a few like autumn-y and spooky books. And this is sort of the first one. I got Autumn by Ali Smith, who I wasn't particularly interested in, but I found a copy for 500 yen at the bookstore. I think when I went to Nagoya. It's got this like warp in it, so that might have been part of why it was on sale. And it had this really big text to it, and I don't know, I just thought it's an interesting idea, literary study looking at the Four Seasons, and, the book doesn't necessarily deal directly with autumn, but I thought now was as good a time as ever to give it a go. The story is about the relationship between a young woman named Elizabeth and a 100-year-old man named Daniel. The opening of the book is sort of Daniel's, like, hallucination as he's ill in like a hospice care. He's sort of at the end of his life. I mean, he's 100 years old, so it deals with Daniel's life as a sort of young aesthete, and as he's older he meets Elizabeth and becomes like a babysitter and teaches her the values of beauty and art and stuff. So she's asking all of these profound questions as a young child, and she's dealing with her mother, sort of going out and leaving her by herself. And then Elizabeth grows up and becomes sort of an art lecturer and looks into this artist who was a friend of Daniel's. And in the background of all of this, she's talking about Brexit as well, and the ramifications of that slowly playing out as these memories are playing back and forth. It was kind of a lot. It didn't all come together for me as well as I would have liked. I really like these stories about generational relationships that deal with arts and the coming and going of art movements. I'd like to, maybe I'd try to read Winter. I don't think they're directly related. I don't think it's a continuation of the story. It's just kind of this bigger creative project that Smith is going for. We'll see. If I can find a cheap copy out here, I'll go for it. But in general, I thought this book was good, but I wish it had sort of given me a little bit more of a core to sort of tether myself to as these memories and times are flying by and coming together. After that, I got a little spooky. I read Poe's Poems. I found this neat little hardcover out here for just a few hundred yen, I think. There's the price, 800 yen, so at the time that was like less than $6, and it's just Poe's Poems with a little introduction from Christopher Moore, who I think he's the guy who wrote like Lamb, right? Is that right? Is that guy? I hadn't read any of Poe's poems besides The Raven, and I think I had to read that one in school, so I didn't know what I was getting into, but having read some Baudelaire this year and getting more into that side of literature, when I saw this one, I thought, it would be worth an excursion into Poe's poems. And a lot of them are great. Annabelle Lee and The Bells, these poems are really excellent. They're musical, and when you read them to yourself, you can really hear what's going on. I mean, especially The Bells, right? That one is just ding dong, ding dong. I enjoyed a lot of these. I enjoyed the tone. I enjoyed this sort of beautiful decay that's going on around him, and his lost loves and the things he's trying to capture. I don't really have too much else to say about it other than I'm happy I got to them, and I'll read Poe's stories someday soon. I don't know if he's necessarily regarded as an excellent poet, but it's good for me as kind of a novice poetry reader. I don't really know what I'm doing when I read poems a lot, so I think this style is sort of easy to figure out. If you read it out loud to yourself, you can really hear what's going on easily. And, they're not translated, which takes, especially in poetry, translation is totally fraught, right? Like, I feel like I never really know what I'm getting. I also wish I knew the order that was chosen here. Like, I don't think they're in chronological order, and they're not in alphabetical order, so other than that, I was really happy to read this one. The majority of this month for me was taken up reading Dickens, reading Bleak House. October, that's the time you're supposed to read Dickens, right? And I finally did. I finally went for it. I've never read any Dickens before this one, and I'd gone through like 3 or 4 copies and sold them because I just thought, I'm never going to get to it, but I finally did it. And Bleak House is good. I really thought it was good. I don't know. It's strange because the writing is so beautiful and funny, and the characters are really memorable. It's almost exactly what I expected reading Dickens would be like. Perhaps I thought it would be a little bit more saccharine, but there's some pretty like strange, far out stuff going on in here. This spontaneous combustion and what does he call it? Wigulation? Yeah, this one, this wiglomeration, this kind of word for this endless bureaucracy and proceedings that lead nowhere. And it reminded me of Evan Dara and Evan Dara's ideas in The Easy Chain, which is really, it's stunning that Dickens and is sort of dealing with that stuff 50 years before. A lot of people also compare Bleak House to Kafka because of the sort of endless bureaucratic meanderings, but it's not really like that at all. The characters are all perfectly crafted to play a role in the story and come together at the right time, and Dickens' hand is really powerful in the book. You can really feel an author working here, like he's creating this thing with intention. These images are really beautiful as well. The main through story of Esther and her story was probably my favorite part. Some of the characters are really memorable, and it didn't let me down. It's kind of what I thought Dickens would be, and I didn't find myself groaning or rolling my eyes because of anything being cliche or hackneyed. I really liked it. So I'll give Dickens another go. I think I want to try Our Mutual Friend next. I think I've heard that one's really good. The one thing I'll say about this book is that I really didn't enjoy the introduction, written from Nicola Bradbury. She's like a big-time Victorian 19th century literary critic, and this introduction is like for Dickens experts by a Dickens expert. It's really it's a bit much. It's a bit showy, and I didn't really glean anything from it that I thought would, it wasn't exactly the most inviting introduction. The preface from Terry Eagleton was much better in my opinion. But there's that. That's Bleak House. This next book was a bit of a literary sacrifice. I sort of needed to cleanse my palate from Dickens, and I didn't want to read anything that I was really looking forward to or anything that was going to take me a long time. Dickens, it took me a couple weeks to read that one. So I've had this one on my shelf for a while. The Lady and the Little Fox Fur by Violette Leduc, who I think is most famous for her autobiography, La Bâtarde, The Bastard. And Leduc was a French writer in the 20th century. She was peers with Camus and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and that crowd. And so I think her autobiography is what she's most famous for. But this cute little penguin edition, what are these called? Penguin European writers. They've got some really interesting titles. They've got Heinrich Boll here and César Pavese, and interesting stuff. So I went for this one. They're not too expensive as far as getting a trade paperback in Japan goes. So I picked it up, and at first I was really into it. It's about this old woman who is kind of destitute, and it's sort of recounting her like daily routine as she's sort of making a world for herself in Paris, outside of society. She's kind of an outsider. And I really enjoyed this section. There's a really memorable passage where she's sort of sitting on a bollard and staring out at the pier watching dock workers. And I really liked that. But it totally devolves into this like surreal mush. I really lost the thread. I really couldn't tell you what in the world is going on in the last like 60 pages. It's only 80 pages, and I liked the first 25 or so pages. She finds like a fox fur in like a package, or she's looking around for like food or something, and she finds a fox fur, and it becomes this like religious, mind-bending, totally crazy freak out for her, and she loses touch with whatever semblance of sort of our modern social norms she had. That said, I mean, there's some excellent writing in here. There's some really nice quotes. She's got an ear for like a punchy line. Someone was beaming the searchlight of happiness into her room. Happiness. It had been necessary for her to grow old before she could think of it unexpectedly like that, without having ever understood what it is. Happiness is something you discover afterwards, she said categorically, as if she had been happy once. These really nice, like, punchy, quotable lines, but the whole thing, I didn't get it, I think, and I can't say I cared for it too much, but the ideas are good, and she was well regarded by her peers, and so, like I said, I think her autobiography is something I will keep my eyes open for, but I can't say I'm too enthusiastic about this one. After that, I read Augustus by John Williams. I've completed John Williams' big three at this point. I read Stoner and Butcher's Crossing, and then this one. Stoner, I've got sort of the stereotypical love for Stoner. It's one of my favorite books. I think it's perfect, etc. Endlessly for the rest of my life. Butcher's Crossing was really good. I think it was powerful, and a lot of the images are really they're burned into my brain. No pun intended. And the story is really moving, and I enjoy westerns when they're done well. So that was really great, but. Augustus, I mean, it's got this National Book Award sticker on it, and it's really excellent stuff. This book is, of course, about the life of Augustus Caesar, Gaius Octavius, first emperor of Rome. But, markedly, the key thing here is that you don't really get any of Augustus's own view, his own personal view, until the end of the book, the last 50 pages or so. It's kind of an epistolary novel. It's letters and diaries of people who witnessed his life firsthand, and people who are, exchanging letters. The first bit is a prologue. It's the letter from Julius Caesar. Send the boy to Apollonia. And this sentence is just like, without it there is no Augustus. And so it's a really powerful opening. All the key figures of ancient Rome, they play in here. Mark Antony, Cleopatra, a lot of the poets, Horace and Virgil, their letters to Livy. John Williams does such a good job of giving them a voice, and, they keep the same level. The style of speech is the same, right? It's this really high classical style, really serious prose style. But it doesn't diminish the individuality of the characters at play, and the way they are all in a way remembering or misremembering this history. The key figure besides Augustus himself is probably his daughter Julia, who is writing a bit of a memoir while she's in exile, and those bits, her letters or her diary fragments, are incredibly compelling and moving. Williams does such a good job throughout. The first book, it's split into different books, and the first one is kind of the main like rise of Augustus and his like grabbing of power, and the second one is kind of his maintaining the empire, leading into his eventual demise. And at the end, when we get this third book, we finally get Augustus's own perspective, and he writes letters on 3 days, August 9th, 10th, and 11th. And these 3 letters, they kind of mirror thematically the first book, the second book, and the third book of this own, within this book itself. So the first letter mirrors, he's reflecting on his rise, and the second day he's reflecting on sort of his downward trajectory, and then the last one he's sort of embracing his death. I don't know, man. John Williams is fantastic writer. Everything in this book is note perfect. I have nothing. I can't think of a criticism. I love John Williams. I don't know. I'd have to reread Stoner before I could say whether I think this one is better, but I think those 3 books, it's a body of work that is remarkable and should be, as praised as it has been. The resurgence he's had in the last 10 years or so couldn't be more deserved. Everyone read John Williams, please. That's Augustus. After that, I got spooky again. I finally read Frankenstein. I got this copy out here for super cheap, and I knew that if I read it, I wanted it to be around Halloween, so I went for it. And unlike Bleak House, the introduction here did so much to set the scene and give me a lot of insight into what went on in the writing of this book, the editing of this book, the influences that led to a lot of the choices in the writing style here. Mary Shelley writing this book when she was so young, it's very clear that the people around her had such a huge influence on her. I mean, her parents and her partner, right? The book itself is good. Like, Frankenstein is, like, frankly, as a story, kind of boring. Like the way the story moves, it's just like, it's pretty, flat. Like, I think the themes are really interesting of creation and identity, and I really like the structure and how it sort of goes from outside to within to within to within again, right? We have the main framing device of the guy on like an expedition who encounters Frankenstein, and Frankenstein tells his story, and then we get the monster story, and then within the monster story you have the other story of like the family that he's spying on, and it goes in and out in this really compelling way. But it's not what you think it's going to be. Like, if you just hear, oh yeah, Frankenstein, like, I don't know, or at least that's how I felt. I thought there would be a little bit more theatrics. Like, I almost missed the point when the monster is sort of created and brought into being. Like, it's really not built up in any way. It just sort of like happens as a matter of course, But it was cool. It was really good. Like the vibes were great. Definitely good spooky season stuff. It's not. I say it's boring, but I mean that in the best way possible. And it's not slow. Like, I didn't have trouble turning the pages or anything. I can't say if it matched my expectations or didn't match my expectations. Like, I don't really know at this point what expectations I had. It's the kind of thing that just sort of gets into your consciousness whether you want it to or not, and when you finally read it, it couldn't have ever been anything else, right? But that was Frankenstein. It was really good. I think I enjoyed it. The last book I read this month was The Tale of a Dog by Lars Gustafsson, and I got this one on a whim. I saw it. It was a New Directions book, so anything they put out, I'm game for, more or less. And I think I got it maybe 2 years ago when I was back home at like a half price books. It was in like the bargain section, So I thought, couldn't hurt, right? It's got this really cool picture on the cover. Gustafsson's is a Swedish writer, but I think he's better known in other European countries. He's kind of not like hailed as like a great Swedish author by any means. He's a bit more international European, and he spent some time in the States as well, I think teaching at the University of Austin, which is where this book takes place, in Austin, Texas. And that was pretty cool. It's really cool reading about a place that's so American, right? Like you can't get much more American than Texas, but being written about by a character who's ostensibly a narrator who's from here, but the author is obviously, an implant. This book is all over the place. It's about like a bankruptcy judge who he hears about the death of his teacher. He's got these like interests in philosophy. He studied philosophy in college, and he hears his professor died, and this sort of gets him going on like this thought journey about morality and Saint Anselm's what's it called? I think it's Saint Anselm's ontological argument. This idea that whether there's a God or there's not a God, there is a God because it's better if there is a God than if there isn't a God. And that's kind of it, right? But he uses this as kind of a way to examine society. He sort of relates a lot of moral tales or stories that deal with moral issues from his own life, his family, his friends, his work, his relationships. There's lots of imagery of water and animals. It's very biblical. Clear. I think Gustafsson is interested in the Bible, or at least in how these images from the Bible pertain to life at the end of the 20th century. It's sardonic and funny, but again, it's really all over the place. And this is a chapter about Whole Foods, right? It's got this kind of like sarcastic, like absurd style. It's got notes about American culture in the late 80s and 90s and stuff, and going back into the 60s, when this narrator, the narrator's an older man at this point, and so he's dealing with a lot of time to deal with this issue of morality. I think Gustafsson's clearly a smart guy. And I know this isn't his most famous book, and I saw that there's like a little clip of him on Wikipedia where he says, I think he says that he'd like to be most famous for being a poet, or like he thinks his poems are the best things he does. So I think he's got interesting stuff to say, or at least he's thinking about interesting stuff. So I'd give him another go, but this book was just okay. It reminded me of a lot of, I don't know what it reminded me of. A lot of like stuff that feels like was in the air when I was a kid. Like a lot of the intellectual arguments that had sort of permeated pop culture to that point, to the extent that they would sort of be filtered in through like The Simpsons and South Park and stuff. It was good. It was cool. I was happy to try it. It was a new writer for me, so I'll keep my eyes open for Gustafsson in the future. And he's got these Bible quotes at the beginnings too, so that helps formulate that argument better. Tale of a Dog. That's the last one I read. That was 10 books in October.